A true account of a three-day air show in the early 20s, which turned out to be an OX5 holiday, by Russ Brinkley, Flying Magazine, August 1958. Of the colorful pilot personalities who hit the cow pasture circuits in the stick-and-wire era in the early 1920s, none provided more headline antics than Parker D. Shorty Kramer and his scientific-minded partner, Jack Bartow. I was one of their grease monkeys, paid by dual instruction. Kramer and Bartow, as their elaborate stationery announced, were the Clarion Flyers, their base being the intermediate airmail refueling field midway between Hadley Field, New Jersey, and Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. It was there that they assembled their war surplus loot and turned old propeller hubs into clock stands, many of which still decorate the mantels of Clarion homes. For the first few months of their operation, it was not difficult to lure adventurous passengers into their OX5 Canucks, Jennies, and Standards at rates up to $25 a ride. Then, when the cream of the prospects was exhausted, the rates were gradually reduced to where even $1 a head or a penny a pound failed to attract business. By this time, the pair had established credit with a restaurant, but as winter wore on, both their credit and their patience of the creditor became stretched to the breaking point. Eventually, one morning in early spring, the matter came to a head. The roadmen were given the alternative of paying up or moving their patronage to another beanery. Luck was with the Flyers on that particular morning. The weekly paper, on which I was a cub reporter, carried a front-page announcement that Clarion merchants were planning a 3-day promotion sale, and a special attraction was being sought to lure the citizenry to the county seat. Kramer lost no time in getting to the newspaper office to make a deal with the editor, who was also secretary of the local Aero Club. Within an hour, Shorty had contracted to stage a 3-day air show as the special attraction. He talked real fast when he learned that $300 had been appropriated for it. For that $300, the Merchants Committee was assured of a flying program guaranteed to leave the customers breathless. There would be a half hour of stunt flying, climaxed by a parachute jump on the opening day. The second day would feature a hair-raising flight under the new steel bridge which spanned the narrow Clarion River. The main show would be on Saturday, when Red Jack Bartow would attempt to take off in his converted Thomas Morris OX5 Scout from the main street of the town. 2 weeks of plugging the big event resulted in a banner crowd on opening day. Many of the Outlanders hadn't been to town during the entire winter. They spent money, grabbed up bargains, stashed their purchases in buggies and Model T Fords lining the streets, and awaited the appearance of Kramer and Bartow in their stunting planes. Promptly at 3 p.m., a Standard and a Canuck roared up Main Street low enough to see the whites of their eyes. For the next half hour, the crowd cheered continuously as Shorty and Red went through their bag of tricks. Snap rolls, loops, spins, dives, and zooms. Then, when the stuntmen turned back towards the cow pasture airport, the crowd stood by, waiting for Bartow to return with the ship from which Bill Kramer, Parker's younger brother, was to make a parachute jump. But back at the airport, Kramer and Bartow found no Bill. He had failed to return from Pittsburgh, where he had gone to borrow a chute. An hour passed, and word was phoned to the Flyers that the crowd was becoming impatient. Something had to be done. Shorty snatched up a suit of coveralls, stuffed them with dried corn stalks from a nearby field, and threw the dummy into the OX5 Standard. With Bartow at the controls, the plane took off, flew down Main Street at low altitude, and then, as the crowd cheered, Red set the nose for maximum climb to 2,000 feet. Over the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Main Street, Shorty eventually pushed the dummy overboard. A breeze began to drift it towards the river. When the crowd noted that no parachute opened, it took off running across town and down the hill to the river valley to view the gory remains of young Bill Parker. By the time the hoax was discovered and a committee arrived at the airport, both Kramer and Bartow were well out of reach and planning their program for the next day. The second extravaganza attracted an even bigger crowd because the first day's practical joke had hit the front pages of out-of-town dailies. For this occasion, shopping hours having been extended to 3 p.m., the crowd assembled along the riverbank to witness Kramer and Bartow stage a second stunt show to be climaxed with Bartow flying under the low bridge. Everything went off as scheduled, including a real parachute jump, and then Bartow came barreling down the canyon, headed for the bridge. He made it under the bridge all right, with inches to spare between the prop tips and the bridge structure, but the plane's wheels slapped the water and killed a lot of flying speed. To make it more interesting, the downdrafts from the hills kept the plane from gaining altitude for several miles, and Bartow had to zigzag between the riverbanks. Everyone, including the merchants, was happy and looked forward with glee to the big finale. The Saturday feature was held up until the merchants were sure the shoppers had been satiated. Then a messenger was sent to tell Bartow all was in readiness for his projected takeoff from Main Street. A half hour later, Ken Kiefer, at the wheel of his Model T, towed the Tommy Morris Scout down the main drag so filled with people that progress was impeded. Then, while the local constabulary, aided by volunteers and firemen, held back the crowd, the plane was moved to the corner of 6th Avenue and Main Street and headed down Main, which was only 10 feet wider than the plane's wing spread. Each side of the street was crowded with holiday seekers, any of which could extend a hand and touch the oft-shattered wingtips. Finally, Bartow donned helmet and goggles, climbed into the cockpit, and gave the signal for Kramer to put chocks in front of the wheels and swing the prop. We could see Bartow squint down that narrow street, trees and populace filling its sidewalks on either side, and a line of low telephone wires crossing the street just about where the plane would break ground. On the right side of the street at that point was a long, flat board fence enclosing the backyard of a hotel. Above the fence, rows of hotel laundry hung drying on wash lines. An apple tree in the hotel yard was filled with youngsters who wanted a bird's-eye view of the proceedings. The whole takeoff distance was only about a city block long, and at the end of the block was the hardest gray stone Methodist church ever erected by man. In front of the church was an unusual assortment of tall trees and telephone wires. Just how Red ever expected to fly out of that tanglefoot setup, he never later explained. He was concerned only with the $300 and the feed bill. Finally, with a wave of his hand, Bartow signaled the crowd to move back. Ken Kiefer and Al Haynes pulled the chocks. Forward went the throttle, and the TM moved slowly at first, and then the tail came up as the crowd filled in behind the moving plane and was dusted by its slipstream. To this day, even Bartow doesn't know how he managed to miss the spectators who crowded the curb, for things started to happen when the plane reached the first alley intersection. A hard crosswind down the alley slapped the craft broadside and swung it in a ground loop. It leaped the right curbing over scores of men, women, and children, crashed through the big board fence, and banged headlong into the trunk of the apple tree, jarring down a shower of urchins from the branches. The broken clothesline shed its assortment of sheets and blankets quietly over the wreckage, from which Bartow soon emerged like a beetle from a snowdrift. One of the few townsmen who owned a camera at the time snapped pictures which still adorn Red's scrapbook. Never before or since was more excitement crowded into 3 days. Fun was had by all, and no broken bones. There was some hassle, however, about the distribution of the $300. First was the board bill. That took a healthy bite out of Kramer and Bartow assets. Then came settlement for a rewash of the laundry and damages for the apple tree. But things might have been worse. True, the plane was a washout, but there was enough cash to pay the restaurant and establish credit for another winter. And of course, when you have credit, you don't really need an extra airplane.